Alright, so this is our lecture on the link between exercise, physical activity and psychological well-being. So that can be viewed as either the absence of problems psychologically, such as depression or anxiety, or it can be viewed as the existence of positive attributes. And we're going to try and cover, or allude to at least, both those interpretations, as well as looking in the short and the long term. There are some classic summaries of these in the Weinberg Gould book, and also Biddle and Mutri is a very good source for these types of studies and this sort of information. We're going to spend a bit of time defining our constructs each time, even though we've defined them elsewhere in the unit, just to make sure that we're talking in appropriate terms. We're going to summarise the effects on mood, anxiety and depression, and try and distinguish short versus long-term effects. We're going to spend some time looking at how that might occur, although really when it comes to mechanisms we're still relatively early stages in the research. Just reflect on the methodologies that we use and see how appropriate they are as well. So well-being, psychologically at least, can be the mood or affect, which are relatively short-term, and again we can be looking at the absence of unpleasant things or the presence of positive attributes. You'd expect to have good self-esteem, relative absence of anxiety, and this concept of stress reactivity, where people are more reactive and more susceptible to stress. The same situation for some people might be not that stressful, whereas other people might react more, and that would be called stress reactivity. Depression, obviously that's a clinical disorder most of the time. It comes in different forms, but for the main part we'll be thinking about the more clinical interpretation. You can also associate physical activity with cognitive functioning. There are studies suggesting that perhaps people are able to focus for longer and perhaps think with more clarity after physical activity, and both in the short and long term. There's perhaps some links with personality, and we can also think about sleep as well. We're only going to cover some of those in any detail in this talk, because that's an awful lot of stuff and it's possible that people could easily drift off, but we'll certainly show you how it's done, and then you're welcome to keep looking and to keep digging in this area. When we think about moods, affect and emotion, it's worth trying to distinguish between them. Often they can be synonymous or just used interchangeably. However, if we want to try and build a model that works from the very physiological but still affects how you feel, right the way up to stuff that's quite influenced by how you interpret the world, it's helpful to distinguish. It's helpful to try and build in layers and distinguish between them. So at the most cognitive level, or there's some cognitive appraisal, we can have an emotion. So the world presents you with a stimulus, you interpret the signals that you're being presented with, and as being stressful or good or bad in some way, and that can lead to an emotion. Now, of course, before that is kind of our mood state, and you might argue that the mood that you're in predisposes you to interpret things positively or negatively. It's questionable, it's an argument, it's a theory that we would need to unpack and explore further, but we could say, okay, at the least there is some cognitive element in a mood, not as much as with emotions where it's quite clear what stimuli cause what emotion. With mood, you might say, okay, there's a strong overlap, shall we say, between the physiological state and the day's events, and that would lead to a particular type of mood. Moods tend to fraction off, and we'll see the model in a minute, into about 7 different types of well-defined mood. So there might be more out there, but we tend to focus on these most popular ones. While emotions might be quite quick to change to some extent, in the short term, a particular stimulus changes and you feel very differently very quickly. There's also, as that accrues over time, we can start to look at ideas such as stress as being things where if someone's been under a lot of anxiety for a long time, they'll start to exhibit a classic stress response. In contrast, affective states change very quickly, and I guess it's hard to easily see how they accrue changes. So I can change my affective state by just stepping outside and running up and down the stairs, and my heartbeat and everything would change. It might be that it starts off, for example, feeling good, and then I start to get tired, and that's unpleasant, and it's very immediate, and it only really separates into two things: how energetic and activated am I, and how good or unpleasant is that. And we'll see that model as well. Whereas in the pub with our mates we can use these words interchangeably, in this context we want to try and use them as specifically as possible. So I'll try as best I can to maintain this separation while we're talking about these things. So going way back to the start of the last century, people have been fairly familiar with the idea that physical activity is good for your mood. And it's, you know, fresh air, and it's activating and energising. It's a good thing to do. But when we say exercise makes us feel better, what exactly do we mean? Well, this hopefully will unpack that at least at the level of mood. Most of the research in this area uses the very famous profile of mood states. There are other options available, such as the Brunel Mood Inventory. The POMS, as it's abbreviated, will take anger, depression, tension, confusion and fatigue, which are generally viewed to be negative moods, one positive mood of vigour or energisation, and there's this very famous iceberg profile that people who are active exhibit, and you can see it there, all below the line apart from vigour, which is above the line. And this is an example with runners, comparing them to the average population, and they're less tense, depressed, angry or fatigued and confused, but more energised and vigorous. In our personality lecture we spent some time trying to work out whether that profile is what leads people to become active, or whether being active leads to that profile. And in this particular talk, the assumption will be that it's the being active that is causing that profile. Unpicking that chicken and egg debate is difficult, but you'll see some studies in here where people have actually intervened by asking people to exercise and then looked at the effects on mood, as opposed to just taking it in one slice and assuming that maybe mood causes people to be active, or maybe, you know, vice versa. We can control the time sequence and see how things play out. So to try and summarise all the research in this area, 1991 study analysing 13 studies where people did the POMS after exercising. So this time we actually did the exercise first and then gave them the POMS. Now, effect sizes are measured between 0 and 1. You rarely see anything above 0.5 unless it's extremely strong effects. And here you can see that is the classic iceberg profile played out live for you. And the same happens in 2000 really. The same exact profile occurs whereby people who do some exercise, and in particular we're seeing changes in fitness, that would be ideal, exhibit this profile. And that's perhaps a good thing, because it means that doing exercise is actually rewarding. You feel less of the bad things and more of the good thing. So that's reassuring for those of us who want the population to become more active and healthier as a result. Looking at wide-scale population studies, you can see the classic Allied Dunbar National Fitness Survey in the UK, which just continually showed this small but consistent trend across a large number of people between being active and exhibiting some signs of psychological well-being. Another even larger study by Thirlway and Benton, a slightly higher association this time, in women over 30 and men over 50, so perhaps the effects were more pronounced at those age groups. And then same year, a slightly smaller study, sample, but again, looking at vigorous physical activity being associated with emotional well-being independently from education or social economic status. So regardless of how rich or educated you are, you still feel good if you exercise. And that's important because education levels and social economic status are extremely strong predictors of a lot of things. In fact, they're strong predictors of both of these things, activity levels and happiness or well-being levels. So if you take that out of the equation and still see an effect, that's quite promising. When we look at other classic studies, we can see that Hillier et al. In the 80s found exercise lowered tension and anger and then again raised vigour. However, not all studies support it. So we're looking at these broad reviews here and these collections of lots and lots of data. Occasionally you get exceptions though. So it's worth remembering that the odd study might find a difference. And then we need to know, well, what happened and why? Were there other things going on? Was it a particular participant group who had particular characteristics? It's possible that there's a group out there who don't benefit or don't enjoy exercise as much. Or was it that the exercise itself was of a nature that wasn't enjoyable? Was it, too painful or very unpleasant? Looking now at another summary paper, on average in this 94 paper, almost 2/3 of studies that had done an experiment where you tried to change, for example, the level of activity, found a positive relationship between being active or taking exercise and mood. Interestingly, the effects were more pronounced for people who actually exercised a lot and had become trained. To start off with, when you're unfit, perhaps it's quite unpleasant, and as you become fitter, you actually lose the unpleasant immediate pain and suffering and actually just get to enjoy it more. The immediate effects, the acute effects, were less positive as the intensity increases. So of course, if you exercise to the point where it's genuinely really pushing you and quite unpleasant, that's not as immediately rewarding for your mood. And there's an important point made back in 94 was that we still need to look at exactly what's going on, the causal factors and the mechanisms to actually unpick how it all works. Taking some big studies from North America, similar but different from where the UK data was gathered, you can see that this activity is fairly consistently positively associated with good mental health, and again, that effect is independent of education and usually economic status, which is again really important because economic status and education are strong predictors of many of the things that we're looking at. The effect was stronger for women and those aged over 40, which actually, ironically, is the group very often we're struggling to persuade to become more active in that older age group, either too busy with work or feel unfit, but actually the benefits were stronger in those groups. And so we can start to say, okay, lots of different populations in different countries using different methods for actually collecting the data and different measures of mental health, and we still see these effects. So potentially that's quite persuasive that this is a strong effect, a robust effect. Even when we look at the effect of a single bout of exercise, you'll find lots of studies, and again, don't look much further than Biddle and Mutri for these kind of things, and then you can go and dig if you have a particular interest. Activity levels being associated with a reduction in immediate anxiety and improvements in mood, either because the negative things go away or the positive thing goes up. Vigour goes up, the rest go down. It's difficult for us because we're limited in how we can measure these things. We often have to just use questionnaires. Often we give the same one before and after, and people comply with the expectation that something would have got better and just play along because that's the expectation of the experiment. It's always difficult to distinguish between the levels and whether we're expecting things to change. If something's meant to take a long time to change, like someone's general level of life stress, would one bout of exercise necessarily change that? And some of the measures are quite big and therefore require lots of ticks, and that can be annoying for the participants. Whether that's a price you have to pay to achieve some level of good measurement is an ongoing debate. If we focus on the level of affect, the immediate, almost physical level of how activated you feel and how generally good or bad you feel, we can use this Circumplex model. It literally divides into activation, high or low, on the left-hand side, and then whether that's pleasant or unpleasant, along left to right. So it's possible for us to feel energised and very pleasant, and that probably is very nice. But you can also feel that you're energised in an unpleasant way, for example, anger. You can be lacking energy in an unpleasant way, which might be synonymous with a feeling of depression or perhaps an unpleasant level of tiredness. It's possible to be lacking energy but in a lovely way. For example, you've had a good day's work, you're feeling satisfied but tired, and that would be our bottom right hand side there. So we can use a model like that to look at people's immediate reactions to exercise. And the way it's used actually is simply to ask people as they're exercising to point to positions on this model. And of course, if you do it enough and if you use enough people, you start to end up with an average of the pattern during the exercise. And you can use anchors like energetic, calm, bored and tense just to guide people and help them remember what they're pointed to. So as people progressed through this study, whole Ekkekakis and Petruzello, we can see that people before the exercise were kind of in the middle almost on average, perhaps slightly pleasant but not particularly activated or deactivated. And then at the end of the exercise they were more activated because this was a controlled exercise to exhaustion in this particular version. So more activated, and that was quite pleasant. And then 10 minutes afterwards they had become less activated, still quite happy, and ending up more pleasant, so a nicer feeling, but slightly more tired. Probably not surprising, but at least this shows one methodology we can use to try and track people live rather than offering them a large bank of questions in a questionnaire, which really you can't do while you're exercising. If we do go to exhaustion and take the measures during, so they're pointing while they're doing it, you can see a similar pattern whereby people are reasonably happy beforehand but not particularly activated or deactivated. And then as the exercise kicks in, we can see that they become more energised and they feel that they're working harder. And then as the exercise goes on and we approach what they call volitional exhaustion, where the person says, "That's it, I can't go on," that becomes quite unpleasant. But then almost immediately afterwards, while they're still cooling down, they were swapping back to feeling quite pleasant and less activated. And then as we gradually calm down, we're feeling really quite happy and pleasant and less energised and activated, again, not surprisingly. So that one moment in exercise where you're approaching exhaustion is the only bit where it's unpleasant. And for most of what we're seeing here, early in it and immediately afterwards, people were quite happy and it was a nice feeling. So if we just focus on mood, obviously we've touched on affective states as well in this last few minutes. Physical activity is consistently linked with positive affect and improvements in mood. As a rule of thumb, you get more of the good one, which is vigour, and less of the bad ones, fatigue, confusion, tension, depression and anger. They might be differently sensitive, so they might react to different levels, but ultimately that's the general trend. And even when we do very large scale studies or very large summaries of multiple studies, the effects persist. The interesting thing is where the exceptions occur, we can then look and pause and go, well, what was different? Why was there an exception there? Rather than just going, oh, well, you're about to get exceptions, we can actually learn something by seeing perhaps why the exception occurred. Generally speaking, it's the moderate type which is the most positive. Not enough might not get as the benefits, too much starts to be unpleasant. So if we can pitch it at a moderate level of exercise intensity, that's generally better for someone's psychological well-being. Moving on to the longer term, more cognitive elements of anxiety and stress. Again, it's very accepted in many self-help books and things that exercise is good and it somehow diffuses anger and makes anxiety go away. So it's accepted at a cultural level to some extent, although ironically people don't seem to enact that very easily. What does the actual science say? We need to carefully define any differences here because they're separate but related constructs. Stress is at its core when someone perceives a difference between the demands being placed on them and what they're capable of delivering. And once you perceive that the demands outweigh your resources, then the stress response can start, and that usually involves a wide-ranging response from increased cortisol levels, maybe adrenaline, suppression of the immune system, changes to your visual processing, so you tend to focus on a narrower visual range. It's a very wide-ranging response triggered by the perception that what I'm being asked to do is too difficult. In contrast, anxiety is a negative emotional state characterised by feelings of apprehension and nervousness. So it can be part of the stress response. It might even co-occur. So you're having that perception that things are too difficult. That might be quite prone to inducing anxiety. But the stress response is arguably much more broad, and the definition of stress actually is just that moment where you're perceiving that too much is being asked of you and you can't meet that demand. The reaction you have to that can vary. Some people aren't too worried, well, I'll just have to fail, and some people will take it very personally and be quite upset once they feel they're likely to struggle. So it's useful to separate those two things out because we might expect different responses. Anxiety can be observed at different levels, so we can look at it. It will have an effect on someone's immediate physiology. But because there's an element of interpretation in terms of things are bad, it's usually easier to measure anxiety at a cognitive level than to give someone a questionnaire and say, are you aware of feeling bad a lot of the time? We can also split anxiety into, just to add to the mix, state and trait. So are you anxious right now, and are you prone to being anxious? And obviously one's quite unpleasant and we can try and deal with it, but we also might look at saying, and if exercise could, for example, reduce the likelihood of someone tending always to get anxious, that would be quite good. That would be a useful outcome. We can also separate between clinical and subclinical. So if anxiety reaches a point where it's affecting your ability to live your day-to-day life and making you ill or interfering with your ability to perform tasks and chores, that would be clinical anxiety that requires treatment. Anxiety can get quite bad before it gets to that point, and anything that's subclinical, where it isn't interfering with your day-to-day life, can be dealt with different ways. So we could, for example, just look at whether exercise and activity improves clinical or subclinical or both. There's many types of anxiety, as I've just tried to allude to. You can look at panic attacks, agoraphobia, social anxiety, and differences between the genders, for example. GAD is general anxiety disorder. Overall, however, it affects a lot of people, and if you look at the time lost being off work or early retirement, for example, or actually genuine illness, it costs the US economy $45 billion a year. That's huge, and therefore it's worth getting it right. And if the treatment was something as simple as being active, which for many people is free, that would be a wonderful thing. So we should perhaps be, if that's the case, we should be very focused on getting people active to reduce their levels of anxiety. Meta-analysis, again, looking at a large number of papers and trying to look at the general effect across all of those papers. You've got a paper by Petruzello et al., which had, depending on the measures used, 62 to over 200 papers, or samples, included. And then the McDonald Hodgdon paper looking at just aerobic fitness training, where there was, depending on the measures, 13 through 20. Afterwards, again, there was a review by Leaf, where 14 out of 20 papers showed a positive effect, and certainly none showed a negative effect. So exercise wasn't ever making people more anxious. 6 of the 20 papers couldn't find a difference, but most of them found that exercising was reducing anxiety, which is great. So if we look at the 2 meta-analyses, trait anxiety, almost a personality level of I tend to be anxious quite a lot, moderate effect sizes there. They're respectable, across a large number of papers to be finding 0.25 and 0.3 effect sizes is quite respectable. And really it's the same for state anxiety, so both those meta-analyses are showing across an average of averages that exercise or being fit is a strong way of overcoming anxiety. And again, it's worth distinguishing between the immediate short-term effects of the exercise bout and the sort of resilient effects of just being fit, and perhaps your body copes better with stress and anxiety because you're cardiovascularly fit. To leap on though and just be aware of the problems, we often have small studies with small populations, and it's hard to intervene, and it's quite expensive sometimes to take someone who's a trainer away from their job and deliver our intervention for us instead. So we have a lot of small studies. Very few studies recruit people, look at their levels of activity and their levels of anxiety and watch them over time in the natural world without intervention, just watch what happens, and that's called a prospective study. That's hard to do, and it's quite expensive to keep track, and people just drop out and vanish off the radar. So it's problematic, but worth doing. We tend to look at a narrow age range of the people we can easily get to, and very often that's people who are at school or university. As we get into the older age ranges, it's harder to find those people. They don't all go to one place every day where we can actually get to them and ask them to be exercise, for example. It's rare to have good control groups or to carefully control what we do. So quite often you see interventions where we just do anything that we think will help, and then the experiment isn't that well controlled. It's hard to have a standardised measure. As I said, we've got trait, state, clinical, subclinical. It's very difficult to have something where we're happy that this is the measure we should always use for anxiety. However, the other side of that coin would be if the effects persist through all these different measures, and if we're still seeing the effects regardless of what measure we use, perhaps it's quite a robust and strong effect. In the short-term studies, some people become anxious before they exercise, and afterwards they go, well, that wasn't that bad after all. So it might be that that's all we're finding. I'm not looking forward to this. Actually, it wasn't that bad. An immediate drop in anxiety. That obviously isn't what we're after. We're after something that applies to life in general. And then the big problem still is the mechanism. How does this work? How is it playing out? Is it adrenaline? Is it norepinephrine and all these endogenous opioids? There's one theory that goes, well, is it just the thermal effects of heating up the body? Is it self-esteem, perhaps? Do you know, look, I can do it, I'm not that unfit after all? It could be any of those things. And it's very hard to unpick. So without a mechanism, it's a little bit of an odd finding still. And is it one mechanism, or is it all of those mechanisms, which is possible? When we look for a consensus, we get some quite large-scale papers sometimes commissioned by national governments, generally showing, that's a snippet from the Biddle and Mutri textbook, generally showing either small or moderate effect sizes. Training, chronic exercise, can reduce trait anxiety, and a single burst of exercise can reduce state anxiety. Unsurprising, perhaps, but consistent, very consistent findings. Where you do proper randomised control trials, you get very clear, very strong effects, but they're very hard to do. And generally speaking, it's afterwards the people feel good and feel happy. Sometimes during it becomes a little bit unpleasant, but fairly reliably after exercise, people are feeling better. And that's, both the data and the experts in the field, doing consensus statements, all generally converging on these points, which is good. It's hard to get consensus in science sometimes. When we ask, for example, doctors who are asking people to go and do exercise, what the barriers might be, either in clinical psychology courses, they're supposed to help their clients, and the most obvious thing sometimes is to say, I know you feel very bad, but could you do some exercise? The kind of responses that we would get would be, well, exercise, it's not sophisticated, it's not technologically advanced, it doesn't seem as clever as a drug or some new therapy. So we just don't tend to think of it. And very rarely do psychologists refer to exercise practitioners to try and get their clients to become more active. Less than a quarter of the time across all these different courses and training colleges. It turned out as well that clinical psychologists didn't always know that they could be referring to exercise professionals, and they weren't always comfortable with the evidence. They hadn't been and read about it, so they didn't know that it was as effective as it appears to be. Which is interesting in terms of, our practitioners themselves aren't always recommending people with anxiety to go and be active. Earlier on I listed some potential mechanisms, and here they are again. You could look at biochemical mechanisms in terms of endorphins, serotonin, norepinephrine. Do any of those things change during exercise, and would that explain the changes in mood and affect? You could look at perhaps people realise that it changes their body image. They go, oh, maybe I'm not unfit after all, maybe I am stronger than I thought. And equally, people like experiencing mastery, so if the task involves some challenge, then perhaps that's, succeeding also boosts their self-esteem. Physiologically, you could say, well, thermogenic response is the idea that it makes your body hot, and that might have some effects. Or maybe you get more oxygen into the central nervous system and the spinal fluid, and maybe that's a good thing. But these are all just potential, possible explanations for what appears to be a fairly robust effect. And again, it could be the case that it's several of these in unison, in perhaps different combinations depending on whether we're looking at short-term or long-term. But unpicking which of these are in operation is an important aspect of our current science. So as I mentioned, thermogenic would say, okay, increasing core body temperature somehow is good, or perhaps it's just a decrease in the muscle tension because you've used them and therefore relaxed them. Another popular explanation is that it's just the endorphins, natural painkillers, and that produces that kind of runner's high. We've got various neurotransmitters, and perhaps they change during exercise. Some of them are activators and therefore increase certain circuits' activity. But then you also got inhibitory transmitters that need to inhibit certain messages, and that's an important aspect of the regulation in our body, and so GABA would be doing that. Does that change in exercise? And again, is it a short-term change or a long-term change? We need to get to the bottom of these mechanisms, and as I said, it's very difficult to do, and it would take some elegant experiments to do it, but that's not to say we shouldn't try. So in conclusion, well, overall we have quite a strong effect, and then it's just a matter of explaining why that's happening. We appear to have reduced anxiety, certainly in non-clinical populations. It's possible in clinical as well. We see, however we measure it, the effect tends to persist. So on the one hand, that's quite messy. On the other hand, the effect still seems to survive. We also, for what it's worth, do see benefits in positive measures such as the vigour part of the mood scale. We could do with looking more at clinical populations who might benefit most from it, but equally when you feel anxious or depressed, that's often when you're least likely to want to do exercise, so there's potentially a bit of a difficulty to overcome there. Really importantly though, we never see negative outcomes in our experiments. There might be reasons to hypothetically why we should, restrain ourselves from recommending exercise as a treatment for anxiety or low mood, but rarely do we see, in fact, the studies that we've got don't show anybody getting worse. We generally see either an improvement or no improvement, or our instruments aren't sensitive enough to detect an improvement, but we're not seeing that it's doing any harm to people's psychological well-being. Of course, you can get physical injuries, but hopefully that's something people know in advance. Some good readings here. You're welcome. I always tend to gravitate back towards Biddle and Mutri and Bill Fox and Boucher. The textbook for our course also addresses this and does a good job. So, as always, if you're asked to talk about this, that's hopefully a good grounding for you. And remember that the evidence is there, the definitions are there, the measurement issues are there, and then in applied practice, as to how we actually take this out and promote exercise and activity as a treatment for these things. People's thoughts are in these chapters for you and in the literature, and it's a good challenge to try and solve. So by all means, engage with that should that be your research question.